the pandemic has done two things. Yes, you are right that it has expanded the scope and the scale of government role or engagement. Right? There is no doubt that's true across the world. Uh, but it, I think also at the same time, and this something is not as emphasized or talked about, unfortunately, right? Is the scope and the scale of civil society. Right? As you know, at least in India, that we know more specifically, right? Much of the initial help that people needed, right? As the businesses, as the lockdown got implemented, right? Businesses got closed down, right? People who were daily wage earners, the small entrepreneurs on the streets of India, right? All of them lost their livelihood almost overnight. And much of the support for that group of people in the country. And there are several hundred millions of people in that group, right? Who make a living on a daily basis, right? And they got support not so much from the state, how civil society has come together and take up the mantle of leadership in providing that initial support. Yes, civil society is limited in capacity to some extent. It comes to the scale at which they can provide the support. And ultimately, you do depend on the state to continue that work. But much of the initial help came from civil society, right? And it also makes sense. The government does not know where the people are in that sense. Right? People know where the people are. And therefore, people are the best sort of early helpers in any catastrophe, any tragedy. So I think lockdown impact and the severity of that impact, to the extent that it was sort of counterbalanced, is largely because of civil society efforts. So I think that part needs to be emphasized. I think we don't see much talk about it because data is not as easily available, right? Nobody talks about that I contributed 10,000 or 20,000 or 2 lakhs or 10 lakhs, right? To various groups of people, including people who used to work in my own company or household. And I think that part obviously is difficult to collect data on, but I think it's important to remind people how critical that has been in weathering the storm. I do agree that there's a huge challenge of the scale at which state has expanded, both in terms of private lives, and of course there's a very good reasons given that we need to do contact tracing that requires that you authorize particular apps to be able to track you down, right? And also track who you are meeting, who are the people in your surrounding areas where you have gone. Now, I think we know there are better ways of doing it, right? You can have contact tracing without any central database being created. Right? So you can keep things localized on the cell phones of the people, right? The apps that people are using. So there are many ways in which we can follow some of the procedures we need to follow for safety and health, right? Without giving too much power to the state, right? Without giving the data the state can abuse now or later. I think there's a lot of learning that we had in terms of how to use technology more effectively and constructively so that we don't give up the personal liberties and freedoms, and also, I think, personal information to people who don't need to have that information. There's also other side to it, is a fiscal problem. Right? So one is the privacy and personal freedom issue. Second is sort of fiscal issue in terms of the expansion of the state. Right? And as you know, the scale of subsidies and handouts and the state support which has been given to people. I think that this needs to be analyzed a little more deeply in terms of how much is really helping, how much is simply helping the state to expand its powers and intrusion in people's lives. I think there has to be some balancing act that we need to think about. Yes, people do need help, there is no doubt, but there are better ways of helping them, as we found in case of technology, better ways to do the contact tracing without really giving all information to one single central database. Right? I think we do apply that thinking also to the fiscal support that we need to provide. I don't want to go into sort of mechanics of how to do that because there are, of course, many ideas on the table. Right? And this is well discussed, debated issue. I think it does require deep thinking on our part about how do you create a system where people get the help they need without actually the fear of the future. Important phrase, the eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, right? Is becoming far more evident, right, on a day-to-day basis now. But unless you keep eye on what the state is doing, how it's being done, we are going to be in a far worse situation coming out of the pandemic than we went into.